Maribel is not the kind of woman one looks at and thinks, she's going to save the frontier. She was the kind of person who was seen through, at the grocery store, at church, at every party where she sat alone in the corner. But Coulter Vance, the richest and toughest man in Dust Creek, chose her. Not out of pity, not because there are no other options, but because he saw something the whole town overlooked. The question is, will that be enough to save them all? Hit like, comment on the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come, and follow the channel so you don't miss the next part. The morning Coulter Vance rode into Dust Creek to post a notice at the general store, 3 widows were already waiting on the porch. Not by coincidence. Everybody in a 50-mile radius knew that Coulter had been running the Vance spread alone for going on 4 years now, since his mother passed and his last hired hand quit over a wage dispute. The ranch was productive, the cattle were healthy, the water rights were solid, and Coulter himself was still upright, still solvent, still unmarried at 38 years old, which in 1882, on the high plains of the Oklahoma Territory, made him something close to a miracle. The widows, Dorothea Crane, Lucille Fenn, and Agnes Whitmore, had positioned themselves with the kind of casual precision that suggested they'd been practicing. Dorothea had on her green dress, the good one with the ivory buttons. Lucille had done something elaborate with her hair. Agnes held a wrapped loaf of bread because she'd decided, after much deliberation, that men responded to bread. Coulter tied his horse to the post, nodded at all 3 of them without slowing down, and walked straight inside. He was in there for 11 minutes. When he came back out, the notice was posted. The conversation had been started, and none of it went the way anyone expected. "Morning," he said to the widows collectively. "Good morning, Coulter," Dorothea said, with the particular warmth of a woman who has rehearsed this exchange. He looked at the notice on the board in the window. 3 lines of careful handwriting. Seeking a wife. Practical woman preferred. Inquire at Vance Ranch before end of month. "You looking for help or a wife?" Lucille asked, because Lucille had never been one to waste time. "Both, I expect," Coulter said. He untied his horse. "They tend to come together." "Well," Dorothea straightened slightly, "I imagine you'll have no shortage of options." He swung up into the saddle. "We'll see." He rode away without another word, and the 3 widows looked at each other, and Agnes said quietly, "Did he even look at us?" He had not. The notice stayed up for 2 weeks. In that time, Coulter received 7 letters, 2 visits, and 1 ambush at the feed store that he navigated with all the social grace of a man who would genuinely rather be checking fence lines. The letters ranged from earnest to peculiar. The visits, Dorothea and then Lucille, each arriving at the ranch on separate Sundays with food, good manners, and poorly concealed assessments of the property, went politely nowhere. The feed store ambush involved Agnes and a cousin of Agnes's who had recently moved to Dust Creek, and who Agnes was convinced would be perfect for him. Coulter listened to everyone. He was not rude. He didn't make promises he had no intention of keeping. He just didn't choose any of them, and by the end of the 2nd week, the settlement had taken a collective position. Something was wrong with Coulter Vance. Too particular. Too proud. A man running a spread that size couldn't afford to be either. Nobody was paying much attention to the quiet woman who worked 3 days a week at the post office sorting mail, and the other 2 days helping Mrs. Alderman with laundry and mending. Nobody paid much attention to Maribel at all, which was something she had grown so accustomed to that she had stopped expecting otherwise. She was 24 years old. She was not what people in Dust Creek, in that era, in that particular culture of relentless practicality and equally relentless judgment, called pretty. She was heavy-set in a way that made the other women in town look at her with something caught between pity and relief. She wore her dark hair pulled back because it was easier, and her clothes were clean and plain and chosen for durability rather than impression. She had large hands and a direct way of looking at people that some found uncomfortable because they were not used to being looked at steadily by someone they'd already decided not to look at. She was also, though nobody had thought to find this out, the person who had quietly reorganized the post office filing system when old Mr. Sutter's eyesight got bad, reducing lost mail to almost nothing. She had taught herself to read land survey records out of boredom one winter, and now understood the local water rights situation better than half the ranchers who actually held those rights. She had read every book in the small lending collection at the general store including 3 on soil composition and 2 on cattle disease management, and she had opinions about all of them, which she kept to herself because nobody had ever asked. She heard about Coulter Vance's notice the same way she heard most things, indirectly, when Mrs. Alderman mentioned it while they were folding sheets. "Strange man," Mrs. Alderman said. "Posted a notice like he's looking for a plow horse. Practical woman preferred. What does that mean?" "Probably means what it says," Mara said. "Well, practical isn't romantic." "Maybe he's not looking for romantic." Mrs. Alderman looked at her sideways. "You aren't thinking—" "No," Mara said, and went back to folding. But she was. Not in the way Mrs. Alderman feared, not with any particular softness toward Coulter Vance as a man, since she'd barely seen him, and what she'd seen was mostly a broad-shouldered silence on horseback. What she was thinking about was practical. She was thinking about the fact that she was 24 and had no land, no savings worth speaking of, and no prospects in Dust Creek that extended beyond laundry and mail sorting. She was thinking about the fact that whatever she was or wasn't, she was competent and practical woman preferred was the first invitation she'd ever seen that didn't exclude her on sight. She wrote a letter that evening. 2 paragraphs. She described her experience with bookkeeping, her familiarity with the local water rights records, her willingness to work hard, and her lack of illusions about what a ranch marriage meant. She said nothing about herself in any other regard. She addressed it to Coulter Vance, Vance Ranch, and put it in the outgoing mail the next morning with the same hand she'd used to put in anyone else's letter. Steadily, without drama. She was fairly certain she'd never hear back. Coulter read the letter on a Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He'd read the others at the same table, in the same chair, and set them all aside with the same vague sense of something not quite fitting. He couldn't have explained it precisely. The women who'd written were perfectly reasonable. Some of them were clearly better positioned than he was. A couple were genuinely kind, from what he could tell. None of it sat right. Mara Bell's letter sat right. He couldn't have explained that either. There was nothing flowery about it. There was no attempt to present herself as anything other than what she was, which was a woman with practical skills and clear eyes about what she was signing on for. She didn't tell him she was beautiful or that she would make his house a home. She told him she understood water rights and could keep books, and that she had no family obligations that would complicate a move. He read it twice. Then he sat with it for a while and drank his cold coffee. He knew who Mara Bell was, in the way you know everyone in a small settlement, by sight, by association, by the shape of what people said and didn't say about her. What people said about her in Dust Creek was not much, and what they didn't say was everything. Nobody praised her. Nobody sought her out. She existed in the settlement the way a solid piece of furniture exists in a room, noticed only when moved. He rode into town the following Saturday. He did not go to the post office directly. He went to the feed store first because he needed feed, and then to the general store for supplies, and he paid attention in the way that he had learned to pay attention over 38 years of reading land and weather and animals, quietly, without looking like he was doing it. He watched Mara Bell carry a basket of mail from the post office to the stage stop without being asked, because the regular man was having trouble with his shoulder. He watched her stop when old Mr. Sutter nearly walked into a post, take his arm, and guide him around it without making a production of it. He watched a woman he didn't know say something to her that he couldn't hear, and watched Mara's face, not flinch exactly, but absorb it, the way ground absorbs rain it's learned not to expect too much from. He went to the post office. She was behind the counter when he walked in, and she looked up the way she probably looked up at everyone. Direct, no particular expression. "Mr. Vance," she said. "Miss Bell." He took off his hat. "I got your letter. I figured, or you wouldn't be here. You want to come out and see the ranch?" She looked at him for a moment. "You want to come out and let me see the ranch? Or you want to see if I look like my letter sounds?" He was quiet for a second. "Both, probably." "All right," she said. "Sunday." She came on Sunday. She drove herself in a borrowed wagon, which he noticed, and she arrived on time, which he also noticed. He showed her the house first, which was plain and functional and needed work that he hadn't had time to do. She walked through it without comment until she reached the kitchen, where she stopped and looked at the window. That faces west, she said. It does. Be hot in summer afternoons. It is. A shade overhang would fix it. About 18 inches of overhang. He looked at the window. Huh, he said. He showed her the water situation next, because that was the thing he was most worried about. The spring that fed the main tank was running low, had been for 2 seasons, and he hadn't solved it yet. He took her to the tank and explained what he knew, which was that the source was somewhere up in the rocky ground above the north pasture, but that the channel seemed to be shifting. Mara stood at the edge of the tank and looked up at the slope for a long time. You surveyed the ground up there? Not formally. The water rights records show a secondary channel about a quarter-mile east of where you're looking. It runs through a limestone formation. Limestone channels shift when they fill with sediment. You'd need to dig out a section about... She paused, thinking. I'd have to look at the actual surveys, but it's possible the channel blocked itself. He stared at her. I sort mail, she said, without inflection. I read a lot. He showed her the cattle after that, which was the thing he loved most and talked about least, because talking about cattle in Dust Creek mostly meant listening to men argue about things they were equally wrong about. Mara walked the pasture fence with him and said nothing for a while, just looked. That heifer on the left, she said eventually, the one favoring her right front. I see her. How long? 3 days. You check her hoof? Packed stone. I cleared it yesterday. Still favoring? A little. Mara looked at the heifer. Could be bruised. Could be something else starting. I'd watch her. I am watching her. She nodded. Good. They had supper at the kitchen table that evening, cold meat and bread that Coulter had put out, which was not impressive but was honest. And they talked for 2 hours about the ranch, about the water, about the cattle market, about the land. She asked questions that were specific, and he answered them, and she answered his, and at no point did either of them talk about the things that most people in their situation would have felt obliged to talk about. There was no romance being constructed here. That wasn't what this was. What this was, Coulter thought, was 2 people trying to figure out if they could work together without ruining each other. When she stood up to go, he said, I'd like to call on you formally, if you're willing. She picked up her shawl. I'm willing. People are going to talk. People already talk about me, she said. I've stopped tracking it. She drove herself home in the dark. He stood on the porch and watched the wagon lights disappear down the road and felt, for the first time in a long time, like something was moving in the right direction. Quote, he called on her 3 times over the following 2 weeks. The settlement noticed immediately because settlements always notice. And what the settlement noticed was that Coulter Vance, who had shown no interest in Dorothea Crane's ivory buttons, or Lucille Fenn's elaborate hair, or Agnes Whitmore's bread, was spending his evenings at the rooming house where Mara Bell had a single room, sitting on the porch with her, talking. The reaction was not kind. It wasn't mean exactly, not all of it. Some of it was just the bafflement of people confronting something that didn't fit their map. But some of it was mean, and it lived in the way people talked about Mara when they thought she wasn't listening, and in the way they talked about Coulter when they thought he wasn't paying attention, and in the particular tone that said, we know something about this, you don't. He'll come to his senses, Dorothea Crane said to Lucille Fenn over coffee. It's some kind of, some kind of eccentric impulse. She's not what a man like that needs, Lucille agreed. She's not what any man needs, frankly. She's quiet enough, Agnes said, because Agnes tried to be fair. I'll give her that. Quiet isn't a quality, Dorothea said. Quiet is an absence. Mara heard this because she was passing the window on her way somewhere else, and she did what she had taught herself to do with things like this. She put it down somewhere internal and kept walking. She had been putting things down in that internal place since she was about 12 years old, which was when she'd first fully understood that the way people looked at her was not going to change based on anything she did, and that she could either spend her life trying to fix that, or she could find something else to spend her life on. She had chosen something else. She didn't tell Coulter about what she'd overheard. There was nothing to be gained from it, and she wasn't looking for consolation. But 2 days later, sitting on the porch in the evening while the last of the sun went pink above the flat horizon, she said to him, "You know what people are saying." I have a general idea, he said. Does it bother you? He was quiet for a moment. Does it bother you? I'm used to what people say. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He was looking out at the road, the way he looked at things, steadily, without pretense. It bothers me less than it used to, she said finally, because I understand it better now. They're not trying to be cruel, most of them. They have a picture in their heads of what things should look like, and when something doesn't fit the picture, they react to the discomfort. They think they're reacting to me, but they're really reacting to their own expectation. Coulter was quiet for a while. That's a generous reading. It's an accurate one. Generous would be pretending I think well of all of them anyway. He looked at her then, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that was not romantic exactly, but was something. A mutual recognition, the specific comfort of being seen clearly by someone who is also being seen clearly in return. I want to marry you, he said, if you're still willing. I'm still willing, she said. They married on a Saturday in early October at the courthouse in Dust Creek, with the judge and two witnesses who were not particularly close to either of them, but who were the people available. Mara wore her best dress, which was dark blue and clean, but not new. Coulter wore the same suit he'd worn to his mother's funeral, which he'd had cleaned. Neither of them had thought to get flowers. It was not what the settlement had expected, which was perhaps appropriate. What the settlement had expected, if it was honest with itself, was a wedding of some spectacle. The prosperous rancher choosing the woman who finally won him, with all the attendant celebration that Dust Creek's limited entertainment options made possible. What they got instead was a courthouse door and two people who had made a practical decision and were not performing anything about it. Dorothea Crane heard about it at the general store and was silent for a long moment. He actually did it, she said. He did, said the store owner who had been witness number one. Well, she bought her flour and her sugar and her coffee, and she went home and she sat in her kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But she sat in her kitchen with a feeling she couldn't name, which was something like loss, except for something she'd never actually had. Mara moved her belongings to the Vance Ranch that same afternoon. This did not take long. She had a trunk of clothes, a small box of books, her mother's cast-iron skillet, and a waterproof case of documents she'd accumulated over years of reading at the post office. Land surveys, water rights records, grazing maps, and her own handwritten notes on all of them. She'd never had any particular reason for keeping these things, except that she found the information interesting and didn't know what else to do with herself on long evenings. She put the trunk in the bedroom. She put the skillet on the kitchen stove. She put the document case on the table in the main room and opened it and started organizing, because she was now on a ranch that had a water problem she thought she might be able to solve, and there was no reason to wait. Coulter came in from the pasture an hour later and found her at the table with maps spread out around her. "You settle in all right?" he asked. "Yes." She didn't look up. "Come look at this." He came and looked. She'd found the survey for the North Pasture and laid it next to her handwritten notes on the water rights records, and she was tracing something with her finger. "The secondary channel runs here," she said. "You see it? It goes into this limestone shelf. If there's a sediment blockage, and limestone formations in this kind of soil profile tend to accumulate runoff sediment after wet years, it would be somewhere in this section, here or here." Coulter looked at the map. He looked at her notes. He thought about the spring, which had been running low for 2 seasons, and about all the time he'd spent looking in the wrong place. "I'd need to dig," he said. "You'd need to dig," she agreed, "but it's contained, maybe a day's work if you're in the right spot." He straightened up. "How do you know all this?" She finally looked up at him. "I read," she said. "I had a lot of time." He nodded slowly. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he looked at the maps and he said, "Show me." She showed him. They sat at that table for 2 hours, going through surveys and notes and her careful, specific reasoning. And by the end of it, they had a plan for the water and a starting point for the fence line issue in the South Pasture and a list of 3 other things she'd noticed in the records that were worth investigating. Coulter didn't say much. He listened and he asked questions, and he looked at what she showed him. He was a man who had been running a ranch alone for a long time, and he was not too proud to recognize when someone was showing him something true. When they finally put the maps away, the kitchen was dark and the supper fire had gone cold. "I'll cook," Mara said, practically. "I'll get more wood," Coulter said, practically. They had supper late. It was not a romantic evening. It was not a honeymoon by any conventional measure. But it was real, which was what Mara Bell had been after her whole life without knowing the exact word for it. And she went to bed that night in a strange house that was now technically hers, looking at an unfamiliar ceiling with something in her chest that wasn't happiness exactly, but was solid and calm. And she thought, this is a place I can work from. The rest of October was full. Coulter dug in the north pasture based on Mara's reading of the surveys, and on the third day of digging, he hit the blockage exactly where she'd said, a dense pack of clay-bound sediment that had slowly choked the channel over the last several seasons. He cleared it in a day and a half. The water started moving within hours. He stood at the tank that evening and watched the level rise. He didn't say anything. He wasn't a man who said things about things like that. But the following morning, when Mara was in the kitchen before dawn getting the fire started, he put a cup of coffee on the counter next to her and said, "You were right about the channel." She picked up the coffee. "I know." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I just wanted to say it." "Thank you," she said, which surprised him a little because it wasn't sarcastic. It was just genuine. She'd wanted it said. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. They were learning each other in the way people learn each other when they've skipped the beginning and started in the middle. Not gradually, through the softening of romance, but sharply, through the friction of actual daily life. He was a man of few words who expected those words to carry full weight. She was a woman who thought things through carefully and said them precisely and did not require agreement, but did require honesty. These were not incompatible traits. They were, in fact, reasonably well matched. But it took time to find the rhythm of it, and there were evenings that were awkward and mornings that were stiff, and at least one argument about the fence line in the south pasture that nobody actually won. The town, meanwhile, had not stopped watching. Word of the water situation spread the way things spread in small settlements, imperfectly but comprehensively. Some people heard that the Vance spring had recovered and attributed it to luck, or to Coulter's hard work, or to the simple passage of time. A few people heard the actual story, about the surveys and the sediment blockage, and those few people either didn't believe it or filed it away under the category of useful but inconvenient information and didn't take it back out. What the town did notice was that the Vance Ranch was operating better than it had in years. The cattle were healthy, the water was running, the pastures were being managed with a kind of methodical attention that hadn't been there before. And Mara Vance now, legally, though she hadn't decided yet how she thought about that name, was visibly doing work. Hard, constant, specific work. Not just housework, though she did that too without any particular drama about it. She was out in the pastures. She was reading and making notes and asking Coulter questions and having those questions answered, and then doing the things she'd reasoned out from those answers. The people who had expected her to fail were confused. The people who hadn't expected anything were still not expecting anything. The people who had made it their business to comment on Coulter's choice, and there were several of these, shifted their commentary slightly from, "He'll regret it to well, she works hard enough, I suppose, but was always available, but was a versatile tool. But she's not what a man like that deserves. But she'll never be what that ranch needs in the long run. But working hard isn't the same as having good judgment, and when something goes wrong, and something always went wrong, on a frontier ranch in a difficult season, they'd see." November came cold. The cattle were healthy, and the water was running, and Mara had started in on the ranch bookkeeping, which had been kept in a state of functional but stressful approximation for years. She reorganized it over 3 evenings and showed Coulter the actual picture on the 4th, which was better than he'd feared but not as good as he'd hoped, and they talked about it plainly, which he appreciated. There were things she didn't know. She was clear about that. She hadn't run cattle before. She hadn't negotiated with buyers or managed hired hands or dealt with the particular complications of drought conditions on grazing land. She knew the theory of a great many things and the practice of fewer, and she was honest about which was which, and when she was wrong about something, she said so and adjusted. She was wrong about the south pasture. She'd reasoned from the survey data that the grass there could support more cattle than Coulter was running on it, and he'd tried it her way, and by late November it was clear the grass wasn't recovering the way she'd expected. She went and looked at it and came back and said, "I was wrong. The soil drainage is different from what I read off the survey. You should move them back." "I figured," he said. "You didn't say anything." "I wanted to see how you'd handle being wrong." She looked at him. "How am I doing?" "Fine," he said. "You're doing fine." December came, and the first real cold with it, and a rumor that came down from the northern ranches about drought conditions the following spring. Coulter had heard drought rumors before. They were not always accurate, but they were never nothing. He mentioned it to Mara over supper, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she got her maps back out. She was still at the table when he went to bed. She was there in the morning, with new notes and a different configuration of the surveys, and there were dark marks under her eyes. "You slept?" he asked. "Some," she said, which was not a yes. "What did you find?" She showed him. It wasn't good news, but it was specific, which made it better than no news. The groundwater patterns in the region, based on what she could read in the survey records and the weather data she'd tracked from newspaper reports, suggested the drought potential was real. But there were two alternative water sources within the ranch's existing rights that hadn't been developed. One a seasonal creek that could be diverted with a small earthwork. One a deeper water table that would require a proper well. "The well is expensive," she said. "The diversion is labor. But if you do both before spring, you're insulated." Coulter looked at the numbers she'd put on the paper. "I can do the well. The diversion I'd need help on." "Your neighbor to the north, Aldrich Hansen?" "He's friendly enough. His water situation is probably the same as yours. If you offered to share the diversion labor, he might go in on it," Coulter said. "He might?" Coulter put his hands on the table. He looked at his wife, who was, he realized, someone he had been thinking of as his wife for weeks now without noticing the transition, which was perhaps itself significant, and he said, "You've been thinking about this ranch since before we married." "I've been thinking about this region since before we married," she said. "The ranch is part of the region." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I had a lot of time and no place to put what I figured out, and this seemed like a place that needed it." He nodded. He stood up. "I'll ride over to Hansen's today." "Take the diversion survey," she said. "He'll want to see the numbers." "What?" January passed in cold and work and the kind of daily accumulation that makes up a life when life is built on something real rather than something expected. The well was started. The diversion conversation with Aldrich Hansen had gone better than expected. Hansen had his own water concerns and his own rough understanding of the problem, and when Coulter showed him Mara's survey work and her reasoning, Hansen had sat with it for a while and then said, "Your wife put this together?" "She did," Coulter said. "She surveyed the land herself?" "She read the surveys. She's been reading them for years." Hansen looked at the papers again. He was a methodical man, not easily impressed, with the particular skepticism of someone who'd been sold bad advice before. "This is right," he said finally. "The drainage pattern here, I've been watching this land for 12 years and I couldn't have drawn this, but it's right." They started the diversion work in late January. It took 10 days and a great deal of cold mud and 2 arguments about the channel slope. And it worked. Mara did not ride out to see it finished. She was in the kitchen with a head cold she'd been trying to work through for a week. And when Coulter came back and reported the water was flowing, she was at the table with her notes and a cup of tea, and she said, "Good." And he said, "You should be in bed." And she said, "I've been in bed. I'm bored in bed." He sat down across from her. "Hansen asked about you." "What did he say?" "He said your survey work was good. Better than good. He's talked to a couple of the other ranchers about it." She looked up. "Which ones?" "Beauchamp? Possibly Reyes." She was quiet for a moment. "If the drought comes the way I think it might, they'll all need to look at their water options before spring." "That's what I told Hansen." "And?" "He suggested maybe you'd be willing to go over the surveys with them. A meeting of some kind." She absorbed this. "People know who put this together?" "They do now." She picked up her tea. She looked at the window, the west-facing window that still didn't have its shade overhang, which was on the list but hadn't happened yet. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd ask you." She looked at him. He looked back at her. This marriage they'd made out of practicality and mutual recognition had in 3 months produced something neither of them had particularly aimed for and both of them now depended on. It wasn't what the novels said. It wasn't smooth. It had rough edges and silences and the particular tension of two people who were both used to doing things alone. But it was honest, and it was solid, and it was growing in the way things grow when they have decent ground to grow in. "Tell him yes," she said. "I'll come." Outside, the water was running where it hadn't run before, and the cattle were healthy in the winter pasture, and the night was cold and clear and full of stars over the flat Oklahoma dark. Inside, the fire was burning and the maps were spread on the table, and a woman that nobody in Dust Creek had ever thought to look at twice was looking at the land she now called hers and thinking about what it needed and planning how to give it what she had. The meeting with the neighboring ranchers happened on a Tuesday in early February in the main room of the Vance Ranch, with 6 men sitting in chairs they'd brought themselves because Coulter didn't own enough chairs for that many people. Mara had put coffee on and set out what food she had, which was bread and dried beef and not much else, and she stood at the table with her surveys and her notes, and she talked. She had not been nervous about a great many things in her life, but she was nervous about this. Not visibly. She had a long practice of keeping her face neutral when her insides were doing something less organized, but underneath the steadiness, her hands were slightly cold, and she could feel the specific weight of 6 men looking at her with the particular expression of men who are willing to be convinced but have not yet decided they will be. Aldrich Hansen was the exception. He'd seen the work already. He sat near the back with his arms crossed and his face calm, and when she started talking, he nodded slowly at the first thing she said, which helped. She went through the water situation in the region, using the surveys to show what she'd found and how she'd found it. She explained the drainage patterns and the groundwater indicators and the 2 options she'd identified on each ranch for water source development. She was not flowery about it. She did not perform confidence she didn't have. She said, "I think when she thought something, and I know when she knew it," and she did not blur the line between them. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Beauchamp, a heavy-set man with a gray beard who ran the second largest spread in the area, leaned forward. "You read all this off the surveys?" "The surveys and the weather records I've been keeping." The county surveys." "Yes. Those surveys are 20 years old in some sections." "I know. I cross-referenced the older ones with the more recent filings. Where they conflicted, I used the most recent and noted the discrepancy." He looked at Coulter. "Your wife put all this together herself." "She did," Coulter said from the chair in the corner where he'd positioned himself so that it was clearly her meeting, not his. Beauchamp looked back at Mara. "I've had my foreman trying to work out my water situation for 3 years." "He was probably looking at the surface feed," Mara said. "The surface feed is misleading in your sector because the gradient runs slightly wrong. It looks like it should drain east, but the limestone shelf underneath redirects it north. That's why your east tank fills slowly even after rain." The silence that followed this was different from the first one. Reyes, who was younger than the others and had the sunburned look of a man who spent too much time outdoors without enough hat, said, "That's exactly what my east tank does." "Same formation," Mara said. "I can show you." She showed him. She showed all of them. By the time the meeting broke up 2 hours later, 3 of the men had agreed to cooperative water development, and Beauchamp had asked if Mara would be willing to look at his own survey records in exchange for help with the labor. He said it with the tone of a man making a business offer to another businessman, which was not the tone she was used to hearing directed at herself, and it took her a half-second to calibrate. "Yes," she said. "I'll come over next week." After they left, Coulter washed the coffee cups while she put the surveys away, and he said, "Beauchamp doesn't offer labor easily. I noticed. He's offered it twice in the 12 years I've known him, once to his brother and once to the church when the roof caved." Mara looked at the table, at the dents and scratches in the old wood. "He wasn't offering it to be kind. No, he was offering it because he thinks you're useful." "That's fine," she said. "Useful is good. Useful is... I can work with useful." There was something in her voice that wasn't quite casual. Coulter put the last cup on the shelf and turned around, and he looked at her and he said, "You expected them not to listen." She picked up the last of the surveys. "I expected some of them not to. I prepared for that." "What were you going to do if Beauchamp told you the surveys were wrong?" "Show him the data again and let him decide for himself what wrong looked like." She filed the surveys in the document case. "I found that people who argue with numbers mostly haven't looked at the numbers. When you make them look, they usually stop arguing." "And if they don't stop?" She closed the case. "Then you find someone who will." Ian, the drought rumors proved accurate by March. The spring rains didn't come. The grass that should have been greening by mid-month stayed dry and thin, and the cattle that ranchers were counting on gaining weight on spring pasture were instead standing at the edge of feed they'd already cropped short, heads down, trying to find what wasn't there. The Vance Ranch was better off than most. The water diversion was running. The new well was finished, had been finished since February, and the depth Mara had suggested, deeper than Coulter would have gone on his own, based on her reading of the geological surveys, was pulling clean water from a level the drought hadn't yet reached. The cattle had water. That was not nothing. On 3 neighboring ranches, cattle were being sold early because the owners couldn't sustain them through a dry spring, which meant the market was getting flooded with early inventory and prices were dropping, which hurt everyone. It was during this period that the disappearances started. Not dramatic at first. A couple of cattle missing from the north pasture. The kind of thing that could be straying, could be a gap in the fence, could be any of a dozen ordinary explanations. Coulter checked the fence. The fence was fine. He looked for tracks. The tracks he found were inconclusive. He mentioned it to Mara at the end of March, almost as an afterthought, after supper. "Lost 3 from the north group this week," he said. "Can't find them." She looked up. 3 or approximately 3? "Exactly 3. I did a count." She was quiet for a moment. "You've done a count every week?" "Every month." "Start doing it weekly," she said. He looked at her. "You think it's not straying?" "I think 3 from one pasture in 1 week is a specific number." He started doing weekly counts. By mid-April, the number was 11. They were coming from the north pasture consistently, never the east or south, which eliminated the fence gap theory because the north fence was the one he'd checked most thoroughly. The tracks Coulter found were scuffed and unclear in a way that suggested, to him, deliberate obscuring. He told Mara. She spread the map on the table and they looked at the north pasture in relation to the rest of the land. "There's a canyon access here," she said, pointing, 2 miles north of your fence line. "It comes out on the Brennan Road." "Brennan Road goes to the railhead." "Yes." They looked at each other. "I need to ride out there," Coulter said. "You need to ride out there carefully," Mara said. "If someone's moving cattle through that canyon, they're doing it at night, and they're doing it with enough people to move them quietly." "I'm not afraid of—" "I know you're not afraid," she said, with a directness that was becoming familiar. "Being afraid isn't the point. Being alone and riding into a canyon where people are stealing cattle at night is the point." He was quiet. "Talk to Hansen," she said, "and Reyes. If they're missing cattle too, they probably are," Coulter said. "Reyes mentioned something last week. I didn't think much of it. Find out the numbers. If it's just you, it's a local problem. If it's 3 ranches, it's an organized one." It was 3 ranches. When Coulter rode to Hansen and Reyes the next day, he found that Hansen had lost 9 head since March, and Reyes had lost 6, and neither of them had thought to connect it to a pattern because neither of them had a wife doing weekly counts and asking about specific numbers. The 3 men stood at the fence line between Hansen's north pasture and Coulter's, looking at the canyon ridge in the distance. "Someone knows this land," Hansen said. "Someone who knows the canyon access," Coulter agreed, "and knows our counts are monthly." "Were monthly," Reyes said. He was looking at Coulter. "Your wife told you to count weekly?" "She did." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "My wife tells me things too. I should listen more." The trouble with the hired hand started in April. Coulter had 2. A man named Tuck, who'd been with the ranch for 3 years and was reliable, if unimaginative, and a younger one named Dell, who was strong and willing and not yet sure of himself. Both of them had been polite to Mara in the distant way of men who are unsure how to position themselves relative to a woman in charge of something they don't fully understand. That changed when the gossip reached them, as it always did, through the specific channels by which gossip reaches hired men. A comment at the feed store, a remark at the saloon in town, the particular drip of Dust Creek's collective opinion finding its way into every crack. What the gossip said, in its various forms, was that Coulter Vance had let his wife take over the running of the ranch, that Mara Vance thought she knew better than men who'd worked cattle their whole lives, that the water work had been luck, and the survey talk was a woman playing at man's work. And sooner or later the ranch would pay for having a woman with ideas instead of a woman who knew her place. Mara noticed the change in Tuck and Dell the way she noticed most things. Not immediately, but accurately. Tuck began completing tasks before she could suggest them, not because he'd suddenly become proactive, but because he wanted to demonstrate that he didn't need her suggestions. Dell started asking Coulter questions he would previously have asked her, which she noticed only because she was the one who'd answered those questions most recently, and the answers Coulter gave were slightly less specific. She did not make a scene about any of this. She was not a woman who made scenes, but she watched it, and she thought about it, and she tried to assess whether it was the kind of problem that would resolve itself or the kind that would grow. It grew. The morning she found that the water diversion had been left partially blocked, a maintenance task she'd asked Dell to do 2 days prior, she went to find him in the barn. "The diversion," she said. "He was oiling a harness. He didn't look up." "I'll get to it." "I asked you to do it 2 days ago." "I had other things." "What other things?" He did look up then, with the expression of a young man who has recently been told something that gave him permission to be irritated. "Fence work in the south," he said. "Mr. Vance needed it done." She held his look for a moment. "Did Mr. Vance ask you to do the fence instead of the diversion?" A pause. "He said the fence was important." "The fence is always important. So is the diversion." "Did he specifically say to do the fence instead of the diversion?" Dell's jaw moved slightly. "Not exactly." "The diversion needs to be cleared today," she said. "Not tomorrow, today. If it blocks fully, we lose water pressure in the north tank before evening." She left the barn. Behind her, she heard nothing, which was not agreement but was also not open refusal, and she decided to treat it as the former and verify it later. She went back to the house, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment, and she put her hands flat on the table and she breathed. She was not angry, not exactly. She was tired. There was a difference. Anger was hot and quick, and she'd never had much patience for it as a tool. What she felt was the wearying accumulation of having to fight for the right to do the things she was actually doing. Not a dramatic fight, not a confrontation, just the steady resistance of a world that kept trying to shrink the space she was allowed to occupy. The diversion was cleared by afternoon. She checked it herself. That evening, she told Coulter, flatly and without particular emotion, what had happened. He listened. He didn't interrupt. "I'll talk to Dell," he said. "You don't have to make it about me," she said. "Just make it clear that work she assigns is as binding as work you assign." He was quiet for a moment. "They're talking in town about you running the ranch." "I know. It's getting into the hands." "I know that too." "Does it?" He stopped. "Does it what?" "Does it make you want to pull back, do less of it?" She looked at him. Outside the window, the sun was going down flat and orange over the dry grass, and the north tank was full, and the cattle were where they were supposed to be. "No," she said. "It makes me want to be more careful about how I do it. But I'm not going to do less of it. The ranch needs the work done." Coulter nodded. He went and found Dell the next morning and had a conversation that Mara was not present for, and about which she asked no questions. Whatever was said, Dell completed the next 2 tasks she assigned him, without comment and on time. Tuck, who was older and more set in his positions, remained distant but functional. It was enough. Not comfortable, but enough. The real trouble arrived in May, in the form of a letter from a man named Harlan Greer. Greer was not a rancher. He was what the territory called a land agent, a man who bought and sold and brokered property rights, who arranged financing for struggling operations and acquired the ones that couldn't be saved. His office was in Stillwater, 40 miles east, and his reputation in Dust Creek was the kind that people described carefully, choosing words like effective and business-minded in the way that people choose words when they want to say something else without saying it. The letter was addressed to Coulter and arrived with 3 others on a Thursday. Coulter read it at the table and handed it to Mara without saying anything. Greer was writing, he said, to inquire about the Vance Ranch's interest in a land consolidation arrangement he was organizing in the region. Several ranches were finding the current drought conditions challenging, he noted, and he had investors prepared to offer fair value for properties that their current owners might find difficult to sustain. He was not suggesting the Vance Ranch was in difficulty, he clarified, merely that he liked to approach sound operations first, before the situation in the region became more competitive. Mara read it twice. She put it on the table. "He's offering to buy you out," she said. "That's what it says." "He says fair value." People usually say that. She looked at the letter again. Something in the phrasing bothered her. Not the offer itself, which was transparent enough, but the tone. The particular smoothness of a man who had done this before, who knew the shape of the moment when a rancher starts to feel the pressure of a dry spring, and missing cattle and hired hands who aren't quite reliable, and who had learned to position himself exactly at that moment, in the gap between difficulty and desperation. "Has he written to anyone else here?" she asked. "I don't know." "Find out." She picked up the letter and looked at the date. "He sent this a week ago. He'll follow up." "You think it's connected to the cattle?" She put the letter down. "I think it's interesting timing," she said. "A dry spring, cattle disappearing from 3 ranches, and a land agent writing to offer buyouts to sound operations before things get more competitive." She said the last phrase the way she'd read it, with just enough flatness to make its smoothness visible. "I don't know if it's connected, but I want to know who else got a letter." Coulter rode to Hanson's the next morning. Hanson had gotten a letter. So had Beauchamp. So they found out when they asked around, had Reyes and 2 smaller ranches north of the canyon access that Mara had identified on the map. Every letter had been sent the same week. Every property touched the canyon access in some way, either directly or through adjacent land. "He's not buying one ranch," Mara said when Coulter came home and spread the information on the table. "He's trying to assemble a corridor." Coulter looked at the map she'd pulled out, the same one they'd used for the water, the one with her handwritten notes on the survey data. She was tracing the canyon access and the properties around it, and drawing the shape of what Greer would have if he acquired all of them. "That corridor connects to the railhead," Coulter said. "It's the most direct route in the region for moving cattle in volume," Mara said. "Whoever controls it can charge whatever they want for access. Or they can stock it themselves with cattle bought at depression prices from ranches they've put under pressure." She looked at the map. Her finger rested on the canyon access point. "The cattle disappearing," she said slowly. "The drought. The timing of these letters." She was thinking out loud now, which was something she didn't usually do, and Coulter recognized it and stayed quiet. "If you wanted to depress the value of a set of properties so you could buy them cheap, you'd need the owners to feel the pressure simultaneously. The drought is doing some of that on its own. But the cattle, if someone's moving cattle out of several ranches at once, that accelerates the financial pressure, makes owners feel like they can't sustain operations, makes Greer's offer look more reasonable." Coulter was very still. "You think someone's running the thefts for Greer?" "I think it's possible." She looked up. "I don't know it, but if it's true, the canyon is where it's all happening. The thefts go out through the canyon, and the land Greer wants to consolidate all surrounds the canyon." "I need to ride up there," Coulter said. "Not alone," she said again. This time he didn't argue. They brought Hanson and Reyes into the conversation the following evening. The 4 of them sat around the Vance table, and Mara laid out what she'd reasoned and what she didn't know and what she thought they needed to find out. She was careful about the line between the two. She didn't overstate. She said more than once, "I could be wrong about this part," which was something none of them were used to hearing from someone presenting a theory, and which, paradoxically, made them trust the theory more. Beauchamp came the next day, uninvited, having heard from Hanson that something was being discussed. He sat in the 5th chair. They had 5 now. Mara had found a broken one and fixed it. and he listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Greer." "I don't know for certain," Mara said. "No." Beauchamp's voice was flat. "But I do." He tried the same thing in Pawnee County 4 years ago. Different names, same method. Drought conditions, mysterious livestock pressure, then a series of buyout letters to ranches around a key access point. He looked at the map. He got 6 properties that time. The 7th held out and eventually the whole thing collapsed, but by then 6 families had sold at a third of value. The room was quiet. "He's done this before," Hansen said. "He's done this before," Beauchamp confirmed, "and he's good at it because he never touches anything himself. By the time anyone figures out the shape of it, the pressure's already done its work." Mara looked at Beauchamp. "What happened in Pawnee County with the 7th family?" "They found evidence," Beauchamp said. "A bill of sale for cattle that shouldn't have been for sale, livestock that had been taken off a ranch under pressure and resold through a buyer in Greer's network. They brought it to the county recorder. It didn't put Greer in prison, but it stopped the consolidation." "They had a bill of sale," Mara said. "They got lucky. The buyer made a mistake." Mara looked at the map. Outside, the evening was cooling, and the wind was picking up from the south, carrying the dry smell of a landscape that hadn't had enough rain. She thought about the canyon. She thought about the timing of the thefts and the letters. She thought about Tuck and Dell and their shifting loyalties, and about the particular way that Greer's letter had been phrased, sound operations first, before the situation becomes more competitive, as if the situation were something happening to the region rather than something being done to it. "We need to know who's running the cattle through the canyon," she said, "and we need something on paper." "That means someone watching the canyon at night," Reyes said. "Yes. That's dangerous if they're armed." "Yes," she said again. "It is." She looked at Coulter. He looked back at her. Around the table, 4 men were waiting for something, though none of them could have said exactly what. "We don't do it yet," she said. "We're not ready. We need to know more about Greer's network in this area before we put anyone near that canyon. If we spook them too early, they change the route and we lose the evidence." "So what do we do?" Dell asked. Except it wasn't Dell, it was Reyes, and he was asking it like someone who had not quite decided whether to be frustrated or impressed. "We watch," Mara said. "We count. We document everything, every head missing, every date, every track. We get it all on paper." She put her hand flat on the map. "When we go to that canyon, we go knowing exactly what we're looking for, not before." The men looked at each other. It was not the answer most of them had come looking for. It was patient and careful, and it didn't give anyone a reason to ride hard into anything, which was not the instinct that frontier men brought to frontier problems. But it was right, and they knew it. And that was the thing about Maribel Vance that the town of Dust Creek was still only beginning to understand. She had a way of being right that you couldn't quite argue with, not because she overwhelmed you, but because she'd already thought through the argument you were about to make and accounted for it. Beauchamp stood up first. "I'll start my count tonight," he said. The others followed. When they were gone and the door was closed, Mara sat at the table in the quiet of the evening and looked at the map for a long time. Coulter put a cup of coffee next to her elbow. "You think they'll hold?" he asked. "Beauchamp will," she said. "He understands it." "And the others?" She wrapped her hands around the cup. "They'll hold as long as nothing gets worse fast." "And if it does get worse fast?" She looked at the map. She looked at the canyon access, at the corridor Greer wanted, at the web of land and water and property that a careful, patient man had been slowly assembling around all of them. "Then we'll have to move faster than we planned," she said, "and hope we know enough by then." The wind outside pushed at the window. The fire in the stove clicked and settled, and the drought held, dry and relentless, over all of it. They held for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of counting cattle every few days, of writing dates and numbers in the ledger Mara had set aside specifically for this purpose, of watching the north pasture fence line and the ridge above the canyon access without doing anything about either. 3 weeks of Beauchamp writing over every few days with his own numbers, and Reyes sending word through Hansen, and all of it accumulating on paper in Mara's careful handwriting, dates, head counts, discrepancies, track observations, wind direction, anything that might matter later when they needed to show someone the shape of what had been done to them. It was not easy patience. It was the grinding kind, the kind that cost something. Coulter was not built for watching. He was built for doing, for the physical resolution of physical problems, and 3 weeks of documentation while cattle kept disappearing from his north pasture wore on him in a way that showed, in the set of his jaw at breakfast, in the way he checked the fence line twice on days he'd already checked it once, in the short answers he gave when Mara asked him something he didn't want to think about yet. She didn't push him. She understood what it cost him. But she also didn't change the plan, because the plan was right, and she knew it, and being right sometimes meant absorbing the frustration of people you cared about without letting it move you off the correct position. What they were accumulating was this. Since March, the 5 properties surrounding the canyon access had lost a combined total of 41 head of cattle. The losses came in clusters, never 1 or 2 animals wandering off, always groups of 4 to 7, always from the pastures nearest the canyon, always within a few days of each other in a pattern that suggested coordinated movement rather than opportunistic theft. Mara had mapped the timing on a separate sheet of paper, and the clusters were visible to anyone who looked, a rhythm, a schedule, the signature of something organized. She had also, quietly and without telling anyone she was doing it, written 2 letters. One went to the county recorder's office in Stillwater, requesting copies of any land transfer filings involving Harlan Greer or associated entities in the past 3 years. The other went to a woman she'd corresponded with briefly while working at the post office, the wife of a land attorney in the capital, a woman who'd written once about a property dispute and had seemed, in her letters, to be the kind of person who kept careful track of things. She was waiting for answers to both when the storm came. The dust storm built from the southwest on a Thursday afternoon in late May, the way the worst ones did. Not gradually, not with warning enough to do much about it, but with the sudden specific darkening of the horizon that every person on the Oklahoma plains learned to read as move now, not in a minute, now. By the time Coulter saw it from the south pasture, the wall was already close enough that the leading edge was blocking the sun, turning the afternoon into a strange copper twilight that made the cattle restless and the horses worse. He got the horses into the barn. He got the cattle in the south pasture pushed toward the windbreak. He couldn't reach the north pasture. It was too far, and the storm was moving too fast. Dell was somewhere on the east fence. Tuck had ridden to town that morning for supplies and wasn't back. Coulter was doing the work of 3 men in the last 20 minutes before the storm hit, and he was moving fast enough that he didn't notice, until he got back to the barn and counted that 2 of the horses were missing. Not the barn horses. The 2 he'd left in the north paddock because he'd been planning to move them to the far pasture that afternoon and hadn't gotten to it yet. He told Mara, shouting over the wind that was already pulling at the barn door, "I need to get them. They'll run blind in this." "You can't go out in—" "Mara." He looked at her steadily. "They'll run into the canyon fence or off the ridge. I know where they go when they spook." She looked at him. The storm hit the barn roof like a fist and the whole structure shuddered, and the light outside went from copper to brown to nearly nothing. "Take a rope line," she said, "from the north paddock gate to the canyon fence, something to follow back." "I know." "Coulter." She grabbed his arm. "Someone is out there tonight." He stopped. "The storm," she said. "This is exactly when you'd move cattle. Track's gone in an hour, no visibility. Anyone watching the canyon can't see anything." She was thinking fast, out loud, the way she'd done at the table with the maps. If they're running a load tonight, and they might be, the rhythm puts them about due, they'll be in that canyon right now. All the more reason to get my horses before, all the more reason not to go alone. She let go of his arm. She was already moving toward the wall where the equipment hung. "Give me 5 minutes." "Mara, 5 minutes," she said. "Or I follow you without preparation, which is worse." He stood in the barn door with the storm raging outside and the world reduced to 15 feet of visibility and blowing grit, and he waited 5 minutes. It was one of the harder things he'd done. She came back with the rope, with the rifle from the house, with her coat and her hat tied down, and with the survey map folded into her coat pocket. The one she'd been studying for weeks. The one with the canyon trails marked in her own hand. "You know this canyon?" he said. I know the surveys, she said. It's not the same thing, but it's something. They went out into the storm. Moving through a dust storm at night is a particular kind of blindness. It isn't dark exactly. The blown grit catches what little light exists and refracts it into a strange, flat brownness that removes depth and distance and makes the ground uncertain under your feet. You breathe through cloth. You keep your head down. You move by feel and by the specific knowledge of land you've walked before. Coulter knew this land. He'd run it for 15 years. He moved through the storm with the rope paying out behind him, following the fence line north by touch. And Mara followed the rope, one hand on it at all times, the other arm up against the wind. They found the horses where he'd known they'd be, pressed against the north fence at the corner where the windbreak caught some of the force, heads low, trembling. Getting them calmed enough to lead took time they didn't have, and patience Coulter had to summon from some reserve he didn't know was still full. Mara held both their heads while he worked the lead lines on, talking to them in a low, continuous murmur that he could barely hear over the wind, but that the horses seemed to respond to better than his own silence. "You're good with them," he said, when they had the leads on. "I've been talking to them for months," she said. "They know my voice." He hadn't known that. He filed it away. They were turning back toward the barn, horses in hand, when Mara stopped. He felt the rope go taut. She'd stopped moving. And he turned. She was standing absolutely still, head tilted slightly, the way she stood when she was processing something. "What?" he said, close to her ear. "Listen." He listened. The storm was enormous, a full-body sound, encompassing, the kind that fills every frequency. But underneath it, if you listened past it rather than to it, there was something else, a low bawling, the particular sound of cattle under stress, coming from the northwest, from the canyon. "They're moving a load," she said. In this exactly." Her voice was flat and certain. "This is when they do it." He thought about it for 3 seconds. "We can't see anything in this storm. We don't need to see them. We need to see where they come out." She pulled the map from her coat, which was absurd. You couldn't read a map in a storm at night. But she'd already committed the relevant section to memory, and the pulling of it was a gesture toward the plan rather than an actual consultation. "The canyon has 2 exits. The north exit comes out on the Brennan Road. But there's a secondary trail, and I found it in the surveys. It's older, probably a water channel originally, that comes out on the east side, closer to the Reyes property line." She put the map back. "If I'm right about that trail, someone standing at the east exit point in this storm would be invisible from the canyon floor, and they'd see every animal that came out." Coulter looked at her. Brown air swirled between them. "If you're right about the trail." "If I'm right." "And if you're wrong, we're standing in the middle of a dust storm next to a canyon for no reason." "Yes," she said. "That's the risk." He handed her his horse's lead. "You stay with the horses. I'll go to the east exit." "You don't know where the east exit is," she said. "I do." This was true. He didn't like it, but it was true. "Give me the rifle," he said. "I'm keeping the rifle," she said. "You have the horses." He stared at her. She stared back. The storm screamed between them. "Mara." "Coulter." Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. "I am the one who knows where to go. I am the one who has been thinking about this canyon for 2 months, and I am not going to stand with the horses while you go somewhere you can't find in the dark, and I know the exact route to." She paused. "I'll be careful." "Being careful isn't—" "I'll be very careful," she said. "Take the horses back to the barn. Then come to the east side of the canyon. Follow the fence line east from the north paddock until it ends, then bear northwest. There's a rock formation, 3 stacked boulders. You'll feel them if you can't see them. The exit trail is 20 yards past the formation." He looked at her for a long moment. She was not the woman people in Dust Creek saw, not the plain, overlooked woman who sorted mail and did laundry. She was something harder than that, and clearer, and he had understood this for months, but in the thick, howling dark of the storm, it was particularly visible. 20 yards past the boulders," he said. "Northwest." He took the horses. She went into the storm. Outshot. The east exit trail was exactly where the surveys said it was. which was a relief Mara didn't have time to feel properly, because by the time she found it, she was also hearing, more clearly now, the cattle in the canyon below. She crouched behind the rock formation, 3 boulders stacked by some ancient geology into a rough natural wall, and she waited, rifle across her knees, and she breathed through the cloth over her face, and she thought, count them. Get a count and descriptions if you can. That's all you need. They came out 12 minutes later. 4 men on horseback, moving a group of cattle she counted at 9 head. The storm covered the sound of their movement, but also made them slow. The cattle were balking against the wind, the horses uncertain. And they passed the east exit point at close enough range that Mara could see, in the brown shifting dark, the brand on the nearest animal. Vance brand. Her cattle. She pressed herself flat against the boulders and didn't move. One of the riders pulled up his horse not 30 feet from where she was crouched. The horse had caught something, some wrongness in the air, and was tossing its head. The rider yanked the reins and said something to the man nearest him, and the man nearest him said something back, and Mara held herself completely still and waited. The rider moved on. The cattle moved on. The last man in the group passed the exit point, and the sound of hooves was swallowed by the storm. She counted to 60, then she moved. She didn't follow them. She wasn't suicidal, but she went to the mouth of the exit trail where the cattle had passed. And she looked at the ground, and even in the storm she could see what she needed. Tracks, still fresh enough before the wind erased them, and among the tracks a piece of cloth that had caught on a broken branch at the trail's edge. She pulled it free and put it in her coat pocket and looked at the direction the men had ridden. Brennan Road, north, toward the railhead. She made her way back to the boulders, and she sat there in the shrieking storm, and she waited for Coulter. He arrived 12 minutes later, finding the boulders by feel exactly as she'd said, and he crouched next to her and she told him what she'd seen. He was very quiet. 9 head, he said. 9. All Vance brand from what I could see. 4 riders. You got to look at them. Not their faces, not in this. She touched the pocket with the cloth. But I have something. The storm blew out by morning, leaving behind the flat, scoured silence that always followed. Air scrubbed clean, every loose thing relocated, the landscape subtly rearranged. Coulter rode to Hanson's before breakfast, and then to Rhea's, and by mid-morning they were all at the Vance table again, and Mara spread what she had in front of them. The cloth was a piece of a work shirt, dark blue, with a distinctive double-stitched edge along the tear. It wasn't evidence of much on its own, but it was something, and she laid it next to her ledger with the count records and the timing pattern she'd mapped, and the whole picture together was more than any single piece. 9 head from Vance last night, Hanson said. That's their biggest load yet. They're accelerating, Mara said. They've been escalating the volume each run. That matches what Beauchamp described from Pawnee County. The pace increases as the pressure is supposed to mount. We need to go to the sheriff, Reyes said. We will, Mara said. But we need more than this first. A piece of cloth and a count ledger isn't enough to move against someone like Greer. He's insulated. That's the whole point of the operation. The men running cattle through that canyon aren't Greer. They're hired, and they can be replaced. And if we go to the sheriff now with what we have, Greer closes the route, distances himself, and waits 6 months to start again. So what do we need? Reyes asked. A bill of sale, Beauchamp said quietly from his chair. He'd been listening without speaking since he arrived, and everyone looked at him. That's what stopped him in Pawnee County, paper trail connecting the stolen cattle to a buyer in Greer's network. The cattle went north on Brennan Road last night, Mara said, toward the railhead at Claremore. If they're being sold through the railhead, there will be a transaction record. Livestock sales at the railhead are recorded by the station agent. She looked at Coulter. Someone needs to get to Claremore before those cattle are loaded and dispersed. The room was quiet. That's a 4-hour ride, Coulter said. If you leave now, the storm's cleared. You can make it before afternoon loading. What am I looking for? The station agent's sale records. Any transaction for cattle in the quantity we're missing, logged from a seller without clear ownership documentation, or with documentation that doesn't match legitimate brands. She paused. And if the cattle are still there, 9 Vance-branded cattle are hard to disguise quickly. You identify them. You don't confront anyone. You document and come back. Coulter stood up. Hanson, he said. I'll go with you, Hanson said, already reaching for his hat. They were out the door in 4 minutes. Mara stood on the porch and watched them ride, and Beauchamp came to stand beside her, and they were both quiet for a moment. You think Greer has someone at the railhead? Beauchamp said. I think it's possible, she said, which is why I told Coulter not to confront anyone. He'll do what he thinks is right when he gets there. I know. She crossed her arms. The morning was still and cool after the storm, the way mornings were after big weather, temporarily honest, with nothing left to hide behind. I'm counting on his judgment being better than his impulses. It usually is. Beauchamp made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You know him pretty well for 6 months. I pay attention, she said. She went back inside and she wrote a letter to the county recorder in Stillwater, this time more specific, asking about Greer's recent financing arrangements in the Dust Creek region and whether any land had been transferred or optioned in the past 90 days. She didn't know if she'd get an answer, but she sent it. Coulter and Hanson came back at dusk. They came back with something. Coulter laid it on the table, a single sheet of paper, a copy of a transaction record from the Claremore Railhead Station, which the station agent had provided when Coulter explained he had reason to believe the cattle in question were stolen property, and that he would be returning with the county sheriff to verify the brands. The agent, who was a careful man with no interest in being connected to a livestock theft operation, had been cooperative. The record showed a sale, logged that morning, of 11 head of mixed cattle from a seller identified as a company called Meridian Livestock Holdings. The buyer was a meatpacking operation in Kansas City. 9 of the 11 animals had brands matching the description of Vance and Reyes stock. Meridian Livestock Holdings. Mara looked at the name for a long time. That name means something to you? Coulter asked. I don't know yet, she said, but I've seen it somewhere. She went to the document case and started going through the survey records. Not the surveys themselves, but the accompanying filing paperwork, the legal descriptions and ownership records, and the various notations that accumulated in the margins of official documents when those documents changed hands or were referenced in other filings. She found it in 20 minutes. Meridian Livestock Holdings appeared in a footnote on a financing agreement filed with the county recorder's office 3 years ago in connection with a land acquisition in the next county over. The primary party on the acquisition was a land development entity called Western Horizon Properties. She'd seen Western Horizon Properties before, too. It was listed briefly in the letter Harlan Greer had sent to Coulter, mentioned in passing as one of the investor groups he was representing. She spread the papers on the table and showed the others. The chain wasn't complete. It was never going to be clean and complete. That wasn't how these things worked. But it was visible. Greer's investor network, a shell company holding livestock sales, cattle stolen from ranches Greer was trying to acquire, sold through a railhead to a buyer in another state before anyone could trace them. This is enough, Beauchamp said. He was leaning over the table, looking at what she'd laid out, and his voice had the particular weight of a man who had been waiting a long time for something to become actionable. This is enough to take to the sheriff, and to the county recorder, and if necessary to the federal land office, because some of those survey filings may constitute fraud. It's enough to start, Mara said carefully. It's not enough to finish. Greer will have explanations for every piece of this individually. What we need is for all of it to be in front of the same authority at the same time, so he can't explain one piece while the others sit in different offices. How do we do that? Reyes asked. She thought about it. She pulled a blank sheet from the ledger and she started writing. Not a letter, but a list. Everything they had, in the order it would need to be presented. The thread of it from first missing cattle to the transaction record to the corporate connection to Greer's acquisition letters. She wrote for 15 minutes. Nobody talked. When she finished, she looked at what she had. It was not perfect. There were gaps, places where the connection was reasonable inference rather than direct documentation. But the shape of it was clear, and the shape was damning, and more importantly, the shape was coherent. It told a story that a judge or a federal recorder could follow without needing to already believe it. Beauchamp, she said, you said the man in Pawnee County who stopped Greer. Do you know his name, the attorney who handled it? Cartwright, Beauchamp said. James Cartwright. He's in Guthrie now, I think. Write it down for me. Beauchamp wrote it down. She took the paper and added it to the stack. We need one more thing, she said. We need someone to go back to that canyon and watch it again. Not during a storm, on a clear night, with time to observe and document who's coming and going. She looked at Reyes. Not you or Coulter. You're too visible, too connected to the properties. Someone they don't know. My brother-in-law, Reyes said. He's been visiting. They don't know him. Can he keep his head? He kept his head in worse than watching a canyon. All right. She straightened the papers into a stack and held them with both hands. We have 2 weeks before Greer will expect answers to his buyout letters. If we're going to move, we move before that. When people start refusing him, he'll know something changed. The room absorbed this. The fire had burned low and nobody had added wood, and the light was dim and orange, and it made everyone look older than they were. 2 weeks, Coulter said. 2 weeks, she said. She looked at her husband across the table, at the exhaustion around his eyes, and the steadiness underneath it, and the particular expression he'd developed over 6 months of this marriage that she had come to recognize as something close to trust, or maybe more than trust. And she thought about the horses in the storm, how she'd talked to them in the dark for months without knowing it mattered, and then when it mattered, it had. She thought, we have to know enough before we move. Outside, the wind had died completely. The canyon sat 2 miles north in the dark, and whatever was left of those tracks was gone, scoured clean by the storm. But the paper on the table was real, and the names on it were real, and Maribel Vance was not finished yet, not by a long measure. Reyes's brother-in-law was named Casto, and he was a compact, quiet man of about 30 who had the particular stillness of someone who had learned early that being unnoticed was often more useful than being seen. He arrived at the Vance Ranch the morning after the meeting, introduced himself to Mara with a handshake rather than a hat tip, and listened to what she needed without asking unnecessary questions. 3 nights, she said. Different positions each night, so no pattern. You're counting riders, direction of approach, approximate time windows. You're not following anyone, you're not engaging. You see anything that looks like they've spotted you, you leave. What do I do with what I find? He asked. Write it down the same night. Exact words, exact numbers. Don't trust your memory to hold it accurately by morning. He nodded. And if they're not running? Then we know they've changed something, which is also information. She handed him a folded copy of the relevant survey section. Not the original, she didn't give originals to anyone, with the east exit trail marked. You know this terrain? I'll learn it before dark. He spent the afternoon walking the canyon perimeter on foot, which Mara thought was exactly right, and he was in position by the first night without anyone having seen him go. The first night produced nothing. The second night produced 2 riders moving south through the canyon without cattle, scouts possibly, or a route check, and Casto noted their timing and the description of their horses with the specificity of a man who understood what details were for. The third night, 2 days before Mara's self-imposed deadline, produced a full run. 6 riders, 14 head of cattle, moving north through the canyon at roughly 2 in the morning. Casto counted them from the east ridge and lay flat until they were gone, and then walked back to the Reyes property in the dark and wrote everything down before he slept. He brought the notes to the Vance Ranch at dawn. Mara read them at the kitchen table while Coulter stood at the stove and the coffee heated, and she read them twice. And then she laid them next to the ledger and the transaction record from Claremore and the corporate filing connecting Meridian to Western Horizon to Greer, and she looked at the whole assembled picture for a long moment. It's enough, she said. Coulter turned from the stove. You're sure? It's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. But it's enough to compel an investigation by someone with actual authority to investigate. She straightened the papers. We need Cartwright. But she wrote to James Cartwright in Guthrie that same morning. A letter of 4 pages, organized the way she organized everything. The facts first, then the supporting documents described in sequence, then the specific legal questions she believed the evidence raised, then a direct request for consultation. She did not make it emotional. She did not say what had been done to them was wrong, because anyone with eyes could see that. She said what had been done to them was documentable, and here was the documentation, and here was the pattern it formed. She sent it with Casto, who was riding back through Guthrie anyway, with instructions to deliver it by hand to Cartwright's office and to wait for an acknowledgement. Then she went to see the sheriff. She did not tell Coulter she was going to the sheriff before she went. She told him after, when she came back, and he was quiet for a moment that had several things in it. "You didn't want me there," he said. "I didn't want it to look like I needed you there," she said. "Which is different. Mara, the sheriff was going to look at whoever walked through his door and decide in the first 30 seconds how seriously to take them. If I walk in with my husband, I'm a wife whose husband has a problem. If I walk in alone with an organized file of documentation, I'm the person who assembled the case." She put her coat on the hook. "I needed to be the second one." Coulter sat with this. She could see him working through it. The part of him that wanted to have been there, and the part that recognized she was right, and the friction between those two things. "How'd he take it?" he said finally. "Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped." She sat down. "He's not crooked. I was watching for that, and I don't think he is. But he's cautious, and Greer has a reputation in this region that makes people cautious around anything connected to him." He took the file. He said he'd look at it. "That's not a commitment." "No. But I told him that James Cartwright in Guthrie had been contacted and would be reviewing the same materials, and that changed something in his face." She paused. "Cartwright has a reputation too, a different kind." Coulter nodded slowly. "You're putting pressure from two directions." "I'm making it so that not acting is a more visible choice than acting," she said. "That's all you can do with cautious men. Make the inaction cost something." Cartwright's response came 4 days later, which was faster than she'd expected, and told her something about how he'd read the letter. He was coming to Dust Creek. He would arrive Thursday. He would need to meet with all the affected property owners and review the original documents, not copies. She sent word to Beauchamp, Hansen, and Reyes. She got the originals out of the document case and organized them in the sequence she'd described in the letter. She made a second copy of everything in case something happened to the originals, which was perhaps overcautious, but she'd been overcautious before and found it less costly than the alternative. Coulter watched her work on the Wednesday evening before Cartwright arrived. She'd been at the table for 2 hours, and the fire had burned down, and she had the focused, slightly drawn look of someone pushing through tired to get a thing finished. "Come to bed," he said. "In a while." "Mara, it's done. You've done what you can do tonight." She looked up. He was standing in the doorway to the bedroom, and he looked tired himself, she realized. He'd been running the ranch essentially alone for the past 2 weeks while she'd been at the table, and he hadn't said a word about it, which was its own kind of thing she'd been meaning to acknowledge and hadn't yet gotten to. "The south pasture fence," she said. "You fixed the section near the creek?" "Yesterday." "The north tank level?" "Holding. Mara." She put the papers down. She looked at them for a moment. 4 weeks of assembly, of patience, of reasoning from small pieces toward a shape she'd seen before she had evidence for it. "I keep thinking about what Beauchamp said, about Pawnee County. 6 families who sold at a third of value. We're not selling. I know we're not." She rubbed her face with both hands. "But someone else might. If this takes too long, if Greer gets to someone before Cartwright does." "Who?" She thought about it. "Reyes is solid. Hansen is solid. Beauchamp doesn't scare. The 2 smaller ranches north of the canyon, Ernie Flood's place and the Dahl property, I don't know them as well. Greer sent them letters too. You want to talk to them before Thursday." "I want someone to talk to them, not me. They don't know me, and a woman showing up to tell them to hold their nerve might not land right." She looked at him. "You know Flood?" "Some. He's cautious." "Could you ride over tomorrow?" "I was planning to." He said it simply, without any of the complicated layers it might have had 6 months ago, without the subtext of, "I'm doing this because you asked," or "I'm doing this despite the optics." Just, he was planning to. Because it was the right thing, and they both understood that now without having to negotiate it. "Thank you," she said. "Come to bed," he said again. She came to bed. Yeah. James Cartwright was not what Dust Creek expected from a man with a reputation. He was short, slightly rumpled, with the kind of face that settled into attentiveness rather than authority, and he arrived in a rented buggy with a worn leather case and a manner that suggested he had been to a great many small settlements in difficult situations and had learned to be unimpressive about it. He spent Thursday morning at the Vance table reading the assembled documentation. He asked questions occasionally, specific, technical questions about the survey filings and the corporate connections, and he wrote notes in a small book, and he drank 3 cups of coffee, and by early afternoon he had read everything twice and put it all back in the precise order Mara had arranged it. The Meridian Western Horizon connection, he said. You found this in the margin notation of a financing agreement. In the county recorder's files, Mara said, the original filing from 3 years ago. You requested the filing specifically? I requested all filings involving Greer or associated entities in the past 3 years. That one came with associated entities listed in the documentation. Cartwright looked at her over his coffee cup. Most people wouldn't have known to ask for associated entities. Most people don't read land survey records for entertainment, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. The transaction record from Claremore. Your husband obtained this from the station agent. With the understanding that we'd return with the sheriff to verify brands, the station agent was cooperative. The cattle, have they been recovered? No, they were loaded within 48 hours of the transaction record. They're in Kansas City. That's recoverable through the meatpacking company's intake records if we move quickly enough. He made a note. The observation logs from the canyon. Your witness is reliable? He documented what he saw when he saw it. He's willing to swear to it. Cartwright put down his cup. He looked at the papers spread before him, and he was quiet for a moment that felt like the pause before something shifts in weight. Mrs. Vance, he said, I want to be direct with you about what this is and what it isn't. What you've assembled here is the best organized body of circumstantial evidence I've seen come out of a rural property dispute in 15 years of practice. The chain connecting Greer to the theft operation is not complete. It probably can't be made complete without access to Greer's internal records, which requires a court order, which requires a judge who's willing to look at what you have and find it sufficient. Is it sufficient? For a federal land fraud inquiry? Possibly. The interstate commerce element, cattle stolen in Oklahoma Territory, sold in Kansas, brings federal jurisdiction into play, which changes the calculation. He tapped his pen against the table. For a criminal theft prosecution? Harder. The men running the canyon are the criminal exposure, and Greer's insulation from them is real. He'll have documentation showing Meridian is an independent entity. But if Meridian is fraudulently using his investor network's financing, then it's fraud, and fraud is prosecutable regardless of the corporate structure. He looked at her steadily. You understand this is going to take time. Even if we move today, this is months of legal process, possibly longer. I understand that, she said. Some of those ranches may come under more pressure during that time. I know. She put her hands flat on the table. What do we need to do today? Cartwright spent Thursday afternoon and Friday meeting with each of the ranchers separately, reviewing their individual losses and documentation, and building the consolidated picture that Mara had roughed out in her summary letter. Beauchamp confirmed the Pawnee County history. Casto's observation logs held up to Cartwright's questioning. The station agent in Claremore had, on his own initiative, flagged the transaction for review and retained the original paperwork. On Friday evening, Cartwright sat again at the Vance table with all 5 ranchers present and said, I'm filing with the Federal Land Office on Monday. I'm also preparing an application for a court order compelling Greer's financial records on the basis of the Meridian connection. That application goes to a judge I trust in the Capitol. He looked around the table. In the meantime, none of you respond to Greer's letters. No refusals, no acceptances, nothing. Silence. If he follows up directly, you tell him you're still considering. You need him to believe the operation is still working. And the canyon? Coulter asked. You stop watching it for now. If they run more cattle while the investigation is open, that's evidence in our favor. If they catch someone watching and the operation goes dark, we lose the pattern. Cartwright closed his notebook. I know this is not satisfying. You've had cattle stolen, and you'd like to do something about the men who stole them. The men in that canyon are the ones you can see, and Greer is the one you can't. But the men in the canyon are replaceable. Greer is the operation. We go for Greer." The room was quiet. "How long before we know if the federal filing moves forward?" Hansen asked. 2 to 3 weeks for initial acknowledgement, 4 to 6 for a substantive response. More quiet. The specific quiet of people absorbing a timeline they don't like but understand they can't compress. Ernie Flood, who had come, who had listened, who had not spoken yet, said, "If I hold, and this doesn't work, I'm underwater by fall." Nobody pretended that wasn't true. "I know," Cartwright said. "I'm sorry. I can tell you that the case is solid. I can't tell you it's certain." Flood looked at Mara. She didn't know him well. She'd met him once, briefly, and she didn't know what he was looking for when he looked at her, but she held his gaze and said, "If you sell, he wins, and the rest of us are next. If you hold, we have a chance." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you that's easy, but that's where we are." Flood looked at the table. He was a man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who had built something slowly over a long time and was very aware of what losing it would mean. "All right," he said. "I'll hold." The federal acknowledgement came in 18 days, which was faster than Cartwright had projected, and which meant, he wrote in his accompanying letter, that the land office had found the filing sufficiently substantial to expedite review. The court order application was moving through a judge's office in the capital. And Greer, as best as anyone could determine, had not yet registered that anything was different. He had sent follow-up letters to 2 of the ranchers, which both men had answered with exactly the language Cartwright had specified. "Still considering, we'll be in touch." It was in this interval, the 3 weeks between the federal acknowledgement and the court order decision, that the situation with Tuck finally came to a head. Tuck had been with the Vance Ranch for 3 years before Mara arrived, and his distance from her had hardened over the months into something more specific than discomfort. She had noticed it worsen in the weeks after the canyon, when the ranch's involvement in something larger than itself had become apparent to the hands, and when the settlement's opinion of Mara had begun to show the first signs of shifting in ways that seemed, for reasons she couldn't pin down precisely, to make Tuck more resistant rather than less. What happened was simple. She asked him to check the water level in the north tank and document it, because she was tracking the levels against the drought forecast and needed consistent records. He checked it, and he came back, and he gave the number verbally rather than writing it in the log she'd set up for exactly this purpose. "I need it in the log," she said. "I told you the number. The log is so we have a record over time. I can't track a trend from memory." "It's just a water level." She looked at him. He was not a stupid man. She'd known that from the beginning. And this wasn't stupidity. This was a choice, made consistently, to make her work harder for every ordinary thing that should have gone smoothly. "Write it in the log," she said, "and then we're done with this conversation." He wrote it. He dropped the pencil on the log rather than setting it down, which was not significant except that it was, and he walked out. She told Coulter that evening. She told him plainly, the facts of it, without asking for anything specific. Coulter went quiet in the particular way that meant he was deciding something. "I'll let him go," he said. "You don't have to I've been watching it for 2 months. It's not changing, and it's not going to." He was looking at the fire. "Dell's different. Dell just didn't know how to adjust. He's adjusted." Tuck made a decision. He looked at her. "I should have done it sooner." "I didn't ask you to." "I know you didn't." He said it without blame. "I should have seen it myself." Tuck left the following Monday with 3 weeks' wages and no particular drama. He went to work for a rancher in the north of the territory, which Dust Creek noted and discussed and eventually filed under Not Our Business and moved on. What Dust Creek was actually talking about by that point, in the particular murmuring way that small settlements talk about things they're in the process of revising their opinions about, was Mara Vance and the federal investigation. The news had gotten out, the way news always got out, through partial information and overheard conversations, and Reyes saying something at the feed store that was meant to be quiet but wasn't quite quiet enough. The shape of what the settlement was learning: there had been organized cattle theft across 5 ranches. Someone had figured it out, that someone had assembled documentation, contacted an attorney, initiated a federal inquiry, that someone was Coulter Vance's wife, but the woman who sorted mail and was too plain and too heavy and too quiet, who nobody had expected anything from. Dorothea Crane heard the full account from the general store owner who had it from Beauchamp's wife, and she stood at the counter for a moment with her flower in her hands and said nothing. Apparently she's been tracking the whole thing for months, the store owner said. Survey records, stock counts, the corporate connections. Cartwright said her documentation was the best he'd seen from a civilian. Cartwright said that. That's what Beauchamp's wife said, he said. Dorothea paid for her flower. She went home. She did not tell anyone what she thought about this, because she was a woman who understood the particular cost of saying the wrong thing at a moment when the record was still being written. The court order came through on a Wednesday in early July. It compelled Greer to produce financial records for Meridian Livestock Holdings and Western Horizon Properties within 30 days, and it granted federal investigators access to the Claremore Railhead's transaction records for the past 18 months. Cartwright sent a copy of the order to Morrow with a short note. This is the pivot. What happens in the next 30 days determines the rest. What happened in the next 30 days was methodical and largely invisible to Dust Creek. Federal investigators came through the territory. Quiet men with leather cases who met with Cartwright and the sheriff and went to the railhead and came back. Greer's office in Stillwater was visited twice. The records he produced were, by his accounting, in order. But the investigators had Mara's documentation of the Meridian Western Horizon connection, and they had the transaction records from Claremore, and they had Casto's observation logs, and they had the timeline that showed the theft operations accelerating precisely as Greer's buyout letters went out. And when you laid all of that next to Greer's produced records, there were gaps. Specific, documentable gaps. Money moving through Meridian that didn't correspond to any legitimate livestock transaction. Sale records that appeared in the railhead logs but not in Meridian's books. The gaps were what got him. Not everything. Not the full criminal exposure that anyone who understood what he'd done thought he deserved. That was the thing about careful men with careful structures. You could often prove the fraud without being able to prove the theft directly, because the theft was handled by people who were employed to be expendable. 2 of the 4 riders from the canyon were eventually identified through Casto's descriptions and the horse details and a witness at the Claremore railhead who recognized them. They were charged. They gave up the name of the man who'd hired them, who was a contractor in Stillwater with no visible connection to Greer except through Meridian. The contractor, faced with his own exposure, gave up the financial arrangement. It took 11 weeks from the court order to the moment when Greer's attorney filed a notice withdrawing all acquisition offers in the Dust Creek region. No criminal charge was filed against Greer directly. The insulation held, barely, just enough. But the federal land fraud inquiry produced findings that were forwarded to the territorial governor's office, and Meridian Livestock Holdings was dissolved, and Western Horizon Properties was flagged in the federal recorder system in a way that would complicate every future filing Greer attempted. He didn't go to prison. That was the part that sat badly, and Mara was honest with herself about how badly it sat. A man had deliberately destroyed the financial stability of working ranches, had stolen livestock, manipulated markets, sent letters calculated to feel like opportunity while engineering the conditions that made refusal impossible. And he would face no criminal consequence for the design of it, only for the paperwork that the design had generated. "It's not enough," Reyes said when they got the news. He said it to no one in particular, standing in the Vance yard on a late July afternoon. "No," Mara said, "it isn't. But his operation in this region is finished. The properties stay, the ranches stay, the families stay." She looked at the north pasture, which was dry but holding because the water was running where she'd found it. Sometimes finished has to be enough. The recovered cattle, those that could be identified and traced, were returned through a process that was bureaucratic and slow, and ultimately produced about 2/3 of what had been taken. Beauchamp got 7 of his 9 back. Coulter got 6 of the original 11 that had gone through the canyon. Reyes got 4. It wasn't whole, but it was something, and the ranches that had held through the pressure were intact. Ernie Flood cried when his cattle came back. He was standing in the pen counting them, the way Mara had taught all of them to count now, precisely, by individual animal. And he got to the end of the count and he stood there for a moment and he cried, briefly, the way men do when they've been holding something very tightly for a very long time and can finally let go. He didn't know Mara was nearby. She'd come out to help with the sorting and was at the far end of the pen, and she saw it and she looked away. Because some things are private even when they happen in a cattle pen on a July afternoon with other people around. She looked at the land instead. Dry still, because the drought wasn't going to be over this season. The grass thin and the sky pale with heat. The north tank level lower than she liked, though holding. A lot of work still ahead. Always a lot of work ahead. That was the thing about land. It didn't stop requiring things of you just because you'd managed to keep it. Coulter appeared at her shoulder. He'd been helping with the unloading, and he had dust on his hat and his face, and he looked at what she was looking at. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. They were both looking at the land. "I've been thinking about the shade overhang." She looked at him. "For the west kitchen window," he said. "You mentioned it the first day you came out here. I keep meaning to get to it." She thought about that first day. The walk through the house, the water tank, the heifer favoring her right front. How long ago it felt. How different everything was from how it had been. 18 inches, she said. "I remember." He put his hat back on. "I'll do it this week." She looked back at the land. Flood was wiping his face with his sleeve at the far end of the pen, and the cattle were settling, and the late afternoon light was going gold over the dry grass. It wasn't a perfect picture. Nothing about it was perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs, and it was still standing. That had to be enough. And right now, standing in the dust of a July afternoon, it was. The shade overhang went up on a Thursday in the first week of August. Coulter did it himself, early in the morning before the heat got bad. 18 inches of rough-cut lumber fixed to the exterior above the west kitchen window, exactly as Mara had specified on the first day she'd walked through the house. She was inside when he hammered the last nail, and she heard it, and she came to the window and looked out at the overhang, and then looked at him. "How's that?" he said. She checked the angle. "Good," she said. "That's good." It was not a grand moment. There was no ceremony to it. But she stood at that window for a few seconds longer than necessary, looking at the strip of shade it cast across the sill, and she thought about the woman who had noticed it on a Sunday visit 9 months ago. The woman who had come out to be assessed, who had looked at a west-facing window and thought about summer heat before she'd thought about anything else, because that was how her mind worked, always toward the practical, always toward what a thing actually needed, rather than what it was supposed to look like. She was still that woman. That hadn't changed. What had changed was the ground she was standing on. The drought broke in late August. Not dramatically, but steadily. A week of overcast skies followed by 4 days of slow, soaking rain that came in from the south and stayed. The kind of rain that doesn't make news but saves things. The grass in the pastures greened within 10 days in a way that felt almost aggressive, like it had been waiting the whole dry season for exactly this and was not going to waste the opportunity. Mara walked the north pasture fence on the first clear morning after the rain, doing what she now did twice a week, checking, counting, looking at the land with the specific attention she'd developed over the past year of learning it. The water in the north tank was high. The secondary channel they'd cleared in the winter was running clean. The cattle were thick in the green grass, and she counted them by habit, by the reflex she'd built into herself during the months of the thefts, and they were all there. All of them. Exactly the number there should be. She stood at the fence post for a moment with her hand on the wire, and she felt something that was hard to name. Not relief exactly, because relief implied that the fear was still present, and the fear was gone. It was more like the specific satisfaction of a problem fully resolved, the way a number balances when you've been working it wrong for a long time and then find the error and fix it, and the columns finally come out even. She walked back to the house. She had work to do. So, the cooperative water arrangement that had started as emergency drought planning had by September become something more permanent. Hansen and Coulter had formalized the shared diversion maintenance in writing. Mara had drafted the agreement, 2 pages, plain language, witnessed by Beauchamp, and Reyes had joined, and then Flood, and then the Dahl property, whose owner had come late to the group but had watched everything and drawn his own conclusions. What they had built, without exactly naming it, was a working alliance of 5 ranch properties that shared information about water, grazing, market timing, and land management. It was not formal. There were no officers or dues or meetings scheduled in advance. It operated the way practical things operate when they've grown from necessity rather than design, through the specific relationships of people who had been through something together and come out still trusting each other. Mara was not the leader of this group. She would not have called herself that. But she was the person who had the survey maps, and who understood the water rights architecture of the region better than anyone else, and who had a habit of seeing the shape of problems before they fully formed, and those things made her central in the way that useful things tend to become central. People came to her. That was new. Not Coulter's neighbors, who were indirectly her neighbors. They had been coming to the table since February. But people from further. A woman named Clara Dahl, whose husband was the one who joined the group last, came on a September afternoon with a question about a survey discrepancy on their north boundary. Mara looked at it and found the issue in 20 minutes and explained it clearly, and Clara Dahl sat across the table and listened, and at the end she said, "I should have come sooner." "You came now," Mara said. "My husband said—" Clara stopped, started again. "He was skeptical about coming to you." A lot of people were. Clara looked at the survey. "He's not skeptical anymore." "I know," Mara said. "He fixed his east fence line based on the corrected boundary." Clara looked up, half surprised. "You noticed?" "I walk that way sometimes." There was a pause. Clara Dahl was about Mara's age, maybe a year or 2 older, and she had the look of a woman who had learned early to be careful about who she trusted. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Did it bother you?" "All of it. The things people said." Mara was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the survey spread between them. "Yes," she said, which was the honest answer, not the easy one. "It bothered me more than I let on. It still bothers me sometimes, when I think about it too directly." She folded the corner of the survey back. "But I found out a long time ago that being bothered by it and letting it change what I do are 2 different things. The first one you can't control. The second one you can." Clara was quiet. Then, "That's a hard way to live." "Most ways of living are hard in one way or another," Mara said. "I'd rather be hard in a way I chose than in a way that was chosen for me." It was Beauchamp who said it first, at the October gathering that had become an informal quarterly event at the Vance Ranch. 5 ranchers and their families, eating together, comparing notes on the season, talking about the next one. He said it in the middle of a conversation about the spring water plan, not as a formal statement but as a passing observation, in the way the most accurate things are often said. "Before Mara worked out that channel," he said, "I'd lost 2 summers of production to the water problem. 2 summers. I had my foreman, I had 3 experienced hands, I had my own 30 years on that land." He shook his head. "She'd been here 6 months, and she looked at a county survey, and she saw what I couldn't see in 3 decades. The table was quiet. "I'm not saying that to embarrass myself," Beauchamp said. "I'm saying it because it's true. And true things are worth saying out loud." Mara was at the end of the table, and she did not look up immediately when he said this. She looked at the table, at the grain of the old wood, at the scratches from months of maps and ledgers and documents spread across it. "You listened when I showed you," she said finally. "That matters. A lot of people don't." "We should have listened sooner," Hansen said. "You listened when you had reason to. That's how it works." She looked around the table. "None of us start by trusting strangers. We start by watching and seeing if the watching produces something worth trusting. That's reasonable." "It cost us cattle," Reyes said, "but not bitterly. More like a man recounting the price of something he's reconciled himself to." "It cost us cattle," she agreed, "and the drought cost us cattle, and Greer cost us cattle. The world doesn't hold still while you're making up your mind about things. It keeps costing." She looked at him. "What matters is where you end up." Where they had ended up, 5 ranches intact, water running on all of them, a documented fraud case in the federal record that would follow Harlan Greer for the rest of his professional life, even if it never put him in a cell. 2 men from the canyon doing time for livestock theft. A land agent who had quietly relocated his business to a different territory, having found Dust Creek unprofitable in a specific and permanent way. That was where they'd ended up. Well, the shift in how Dust Creek saw Mara Vance did not happen all at once, and it did not happen cleanly. That is the nature of collective opinion. It moves the way a heavy thing moves, with friction and unevenness and a tendency to stop well short of where it logically ought to go. But it moved. Dorothea Crane was the person Mara least expected it from, which was perhaps why it landed the way it did. It was October, at the general store, and Mara was picking up supplies, and Dorothea was there with her own list. And for a moment they were simply 2 women in a store in the way they'd been, 2 women in a town for the past year without much passing between them. "Mrs. Vance," Dorothea said. "Mrs. Crane." A pause. Dorothea was looking at her flower with more attention than flower required. Then she looked up. "I heard what you did. With the investigation." "A lot of people did," Mara said, without inflection. "I mean," Dorothea stopped, started again. "I said things. Last year. When you 2... She was not a woman who fumbled words easily, and the fumbling was more informative than whatever she'd been trying to say. "They weren't kind things." Mara looked at her steadily. She thought about what she'd told Clara Dahl. "It bothered me more than I let on." She thought about how true that was, how the specific things that were said, not all of them, she hadn't heard all of them, but enough, had gone into that internal place she'd been filling since she was 12 years old, and how they were still there, and how they didn't disappear just because the situation had changed. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say that I was wrong." Mara held Dorothea's look for a moment. The other woman was not comfortable. She wasn't supposed to be comfortable. This was the specific discomfort of a person who had said something unkind and was standing in front of the evidence that it had been unkind, and who was choosing to say so rather than not. That choice cost something, and Mara recognized that. "Thank you," she said. She meant it the same way she'd meant it when she said it to Coulter the morning after the water channel, not as a performance, but as a genuine acknowledgement of something real. Dorothea nodded. She went back to her flower. The conversation was over, and it had been and would probably remain the most they'd ever say to each other about it, and that was fine. Not everything required full resolution. Some things just required one person saying I was wrong and another person saying I hear you, and then both of them going back to their lists. Estcat. Agnes Whitmore, who had been the kindest of the 3 widows in the way that people are kind when they're not threatened enough to be unkind, came by the ranch in November with a loaf of bread. She'd been bringing bread to people in crisis or transition since before Mara arrived in Dust Creek, and she showed up at the Vance door on a cool morning with the bread wrapped in cloth and a look on her face that was somewhere between sheepish and sincere. "I don't know if you eat bread," she said. Mara looked at the loaf. "Everyone eats bread." "Right." Agnes handed it over. "I just wanted to... I've been meaning to come by since everything happened." "Come in," Mara said. "I'll put the kettle on." Agnes sat at the kitchen table, at the same table where the maps had been spread and the documents assembled, and the ranchers had sat in borrowed chairs on a cold February evening when the whole thing was beginning. And she looked around the kitchen, and she said, "It's a good house." "It's getting there," Mara said. The shade overhang was visible through the window. The kitchen was warmer in the afternoons now. There were still things on the list. They drank tea and Agnes talked and Mara listened, which was the natural shape of it. Agnes was a talker, and Mara was a listener, and this was not a bad combination. Agnes talked about the town, about the winter plans, about Ernie Flood's daughter, who was getting married in the spring, about the way things had changed since the investigation. "People talk about you differently now," Agnes said. "Not unkindly, just observationally." "I know. Does that feel good?" Mara thought about it. "It feels accurate," she said finally, "which is different from feeling good. I didn't change. What changed is what people are willing to see." She poured more tea. I try not to be too attached to either version of how people see me, because I didn't control either one. Agnes looked at her over her cup. That's harder than it sounds. It is, Mara agreed. I don't always manage it. Oh, the thing nobody in Dust Creek had quite reckoned with yet, the thing that was still working its way through the settlement's understanding, was that Mara Vance was not a story about exception. She was not the woman who had turned out to be remarkable despite appearances, the hidden diamond, the rough exterior concealing something rare. That framing was comfortable because it left the original judgment intact. It said the mistake had been not seeing her correctly, not making the judgment in the first place. The truth was something less comfortable. The judgment had been wrong not because Mara was secretly extraordinary, but because the judgment itself was a bad tool. It measured the wrong things. It mistook visible for present, quiet for absent, unremarkable surface for unremarkable depth. It had been applied to Mara and found her lacking, and it had also, by necessity, been applied to others in the same settlement who went about their lives under the same finding, who sat in corners at gatherings and sorted mail and did laundry, and never got asked what they thought about the water rights situation or anything else. Mara understood this, probably better than anyone in Dust Creek did, because she had lived inside the finding for 24 years before she'd had the ground to build something different on. She did not say it out loud in these terms. It wasn't her habit to say things that people weren't ready to hear, not because she was timid about it, but because she'd learned that the things that actually changed people's minds were not usually arguments. They were demonstrations. They were the water running where it hadn't run before, and the cattle counted and present, and 5 ranches still standing after a man had organized their destruction with patience and resources and no expectation that anyone would figure it out in time. The demonstration was the argument. She had made it over the course of a year, and it was still being made, and she would keep making it because the ranch still needed it, and the region still needed it, and she still had work to do. November brought the first real cold of the new season, earlier than the year before, which Mara noted in the weather log she'd been keeping since the spring. The log was almost full, a year of daily entries, temperatures and precipitation and wind direction and cattle observations and the various events that had punctuated the seasons. She would start a new one in the new year. She was already thinking about the spring water plan, about the expanded cooperative arrangement, about a survey question in the eastern corner of the property that she'd been meaning to look at more carefully since August. Coulter found her at the table one evening in early November, the familiar position, maps, notes, the specific quality of attention she brought to the land's problems that he had come to find, without ever quite saying so, steadying. "What are you working on?" he asked. "The eastern boundary," she said. "There's a notation in the 78 survey I don't understand, an easement claim that doesn't appear in any of the later filings. It might be nothing. It might be something we need to address before someone else finds it." He looked at the survey over her shoulder. He had been looking at surveys over her shoulder for almost a year, and he understood them better now than he had before, which was not coincidental. "Show me," he said. She showed him. They sat at the table, and she walked him through the notation and what she thought it meant and what she wasn't sure about. And he asked questions, and she answered them. And at some point in the middle of this, the fire needed wood, and he got up and put some on without interrupting the conversation, and came back, and she had moved to the next section of the survey, and they continued. This was what the marriage was. Not the courtship notice in the general store window, not the courthouse ceremony with the borrowed witnesses, not any of the things that Dust Creek had watched with skepticism and then revision. It was this. 2 people sitting at a table on a cold November evening, learning the same piece of land from different angles, building something that was larger than either of them could have built alone. It was not romantic, exactly. It did not look like what people said love was supposed to look like. But it was real, and it was solid, and it was theirs, built from the same materials as everything else Mara had built. Patience, attention, the willingness to see what was actually there rather than what was easier to see. "I'm going to write to the county recorder tomorrow," she said. "Get the original easement documentation." "You think there's an issue?" "I think it's better to know before it becomes one." She looked at him. "It's probably nothing. But I'd rather read a document that says nothing than miss a document that says something." He almost smiled. The almost smile she'd learned to read, the one that meant he was thinking something he liked but wasn't going to say in full. "You're going to be reading documents until you die." "Probably," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's not." Outside, the night was clear and cold and full of the particular silence of a plains winter beginning. The silence of land settling into itself, of water slowing in channels, of grass going dormant. The north tank was full. The cattle were healthy in the winter pasture. The ranch was running with the specific, unpretty competence of a thing being managed by people who knew what they were doing and had paid for that knowledge in the way most true things are paid for. On the wall near the door, Mara had pinned two things: the current survey of the Vance Ranch, marked with her notations in red, and a small piece of paper on which she'd written the count from the last head tally. Both numbers, the land and the livestock, were exactly what they should be. That was enough. That was, in the specific terms of a frontier life in a dry season, in a territory where a careful man had tried to take everything from 5 families who had spent their whole lives building what they had, more than enough. She turned the page of her weather log to the next blank entry. She wrote the date, the temperature, the wind direction. She noted that the north tank was holding. She closed the log. She would open it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the season after that, because the land required it, and the work required it, and she had found, in the strange and practical way of a woman who had always had more to give than anyone thought to ask for, that being required for something real was the closest thing to belonging she had ever known. The fire crackled. Coulter put his coat on the hook. The night settled over the Vance Ranch, over the canyon to the north, and the green pastures and the running water and the 5 properties that were still whole because someone had paid attention. The girl no one had looked at twice had done that. She had not done it to prove anything to anyone. She had done it because the work was there, and she was capable of it, and because sometimes that is exactly enough.